Hello everybody, thanks again for joining me. It's Azure Chris here, and we're going to continue on our 10 steps to get started with Azure for Partners. Today we're talking about number 6, that's Active Directory. So most of you are already familiar with Active Directory, right? It's old technology that's been out for decades upon decades, right? It's that old physical box that you have in a closet somewhere or a colo facility, or it's a virtual machine in a hypervisor cluster somewhere. And it allows you to create that domain structure, right? That schema where you have your companyname.com, and you can create organizational units where you can put your user accounts in one OU and your computer accounts in a different OU, and you can leverage NTLM and Kerberos for authentication and authorization, and then use things like resource delegation management for your end users to be able to access shares on a file server for like marketing or sales and different services like that, or maybe application group to be able to access a database in the back end, but not other groups of users. Now that's great, right, for traditional legacy workloads, things that are on the local area network or behind the firewall. But times have changed, and now your end users are accessing things out in the cloud. In order to address that, Microsoft came out with Azure Active Directory. So Azure Active Directory is a SaaS offering or a software as a service offering that you get when you spin up an Azure subscription or the Microsoft suite of services, so M365 or something like that. And we discussed this when we talked about step number 3 with custom domains, right? So you get your customer name.onmicrosoft.com when you spin up your tenant, and now they're able to log in to the Azure Portal and Microsoft suite of services there. So Azure Active Directory doesn't give you those traditional sets of services, right? It doesn't give you the NTLM, Kerberos, group policy object, infrastructure domain join. It doesn't give you those services. You still have to leverage your traditional Active Directory to get those feature sets. But it does give you things like conditional access, where depending on where your users are set on a different number of conditions, they get access to workloads in Azure or through third-party vendors, right? Another feature is application proxy. So if you have a line of business app on-prem with a web front end, you can publish that out through Azure Active Directory, and now your users can access something on-prem through the internet, through the cloud as a remote user, right? So really great features. Other things like privileged identity management, just in time, things like that, right? When you create your tenant by default, it's a different database, right? It's a different data store. So your user accounts are not tied to the accounts on-prem. So your end users now have different credentials, right? And that could be a very difficult thing for your end users to get used to, as far as culture, as well as a security risk, right? With them using sticky notes on their monitors. In order to leverage the same credentials that are on-prem that you have in your existing data store and domain in Azure Active Directory, you have to leverage a tool called Azure AD Connect. So Azure AD Connect is a tool that you would install on your domain controller or on another virtual machine and point it to the data store. And what that does is that takes all your identities, those user accounts, and replicates them through to Azure Active Directory through your VPN, right? And now you can create that single sign-on or SSO methodology leveraging pass-through hash or pass-through authentication or password hash, right? Depending on what you want to deploy. So those are the different kind of options, or 2 different flavors of Active Directory. The third one is Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So it's a subset of the traditional Active Directory, right? So getting those services, the NTLM, the Kerberos, the group policy objects, when you deploy Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is a platform as a service offering, you deploy it through Azure Active Directory as an extension, and Microsoft spins up 2 virtual machines in the back end as a replica set, where they're taking care of the infrastructure, the patching, the monitoring, the things like that. So you don't have to worry about that like you did with your domain controller that's on-prem, right? The constant Windows updates and things like that, and the disk space that's associated with that, right? So you get a subset of features. So you get your NTLMs, your Kerberos, your group policy objects, you get your virtual machine infrastructure domain join, all those things, fantastic. But there are some things that you have to be aware of because it is a subset of the features. So Azure Active Directory Domain Services is not part of the same forest domain structure hierarchy. It's actually a one-way outbound forest domain trust. So when you spin up this managed domain, you're creating a different namespace. So maybe it's AADS company name.onmicrosoft.com, and you're replicating everything from on-prem through Azure Active Directory and then gets propagated down to Azure Active Directory Domain Services. If you were to create anything in this data store, it would not be replicated back to on-prem. So there are some limitations there. So these are the three different options. Those are the three different flavors of Active Directory. I put these three different options here just for you to understand kind of the different deployment models or architecture types, right? So if you have an existing customer, they have Active Directory on-prem existing, they want to leverage single sign-on, and they are not going to ever deprecate this environment, and they want to leverage hybrid identity and hybrid IT, maybe creating a virtual machine in Azure, promoting it to a domain controller, replicating that schema, and it being the same part of the same schema in Forest is a good option for you, right? That's method number one. Option number two, or method number two, is doing the same thing but leveraging an availability set where you're spinning up multiple virtual machines in different racks in the Azure data center. So if one rack goes down, you have resiliency and the other virtual machine is still running, right? So you get 4 nines for an SLA when you're leveraging availability sets with premium storage. Now, the third option is leveraging that managed offering, right, that replica set with Azure AD DS, where you get that virtual machine, and that gives you the subset of functionality and 3 nines for the SLA, right, and that one-way outbound Forest domain trust. So those are kind of the 3 different topologies or different architecture types to deploy these different solutions. We're going to jump on the desktop. We're going to touch more on the theory. I have a ton of documentation to give you, and hopefully you find this information useful and can use it on your day-to-day. Let's just jump right into it. So thanks for sticking with me, everybody. I appreciate it. So we're continuing on our 10 steps to get started with Azure for Partners, right? Number 6, Active Directory. And we're going to start again once again at my blog page, right? So azurechris.com, you can meet me there, and you can go through all the rest of the 10 steps to get started. If you haven't seen any, you can go back here and you can kind of drill down. But really what I put this together as a landing page, right? So there's a lot of information here. Identity is a huge topic. It's been around for years and years, but it's getting more kind of robust because now the identity is at the forefront of security, right? Like we talked about, no longer accessing things behind the firewall. Now you're accessing things outside in the cloud, and your identity is really kind of the edge, right? That's really where all the security takes place. That's why there's all these different versions of Active Directory. So I provided this brief write-up, and I talked about it, right? I talked about, Azure Active Directory, and we talked about that with step number 1 with RBAC, and number 3 with custom domains, and kind of extending that through a VPN. So I have a little introduction here about the 3 flavors, right? The self-managed Active Directory, that's your traditional version. Azure Active Directory, right? That's for SaaS applications and getting to Salesforce and things like that. And then the new Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is a subset of the traditional that gives you the NTLM and that server join feature set, right? If you are familiar already with Active Directory, and I'm sure a lot of you are, and you just want to drill down into a real quick article to kind of give you what each one of these things does, I have 2 links. One of them here just to start off. You can see compare Active Directory to Azure Active Directory. So this might be a good starting point for you, just to kind of drill down. And you can see how they talk about, identity as a service and all this stuff. But really this table of, the concepts, right? Traditional Active Directory versus Azure Active Directory, and what each kind of feature gives you and how they differ. And you can kind of read through this, right? Admin management, credential management, and kind of the apps and how they all work. So really a great kind of just right off the bat, giving you some good information. Now I want to let you guys know I have a ton of documentation here, a bunch of links, but feel free to drill down, right? That's just a table of contents. You could drill down into these rest of these links and get a ton more information here, right? And then it'll take you on to the next steps, right, as a natural progression, so you can get some more information. So if we bounce out of this link and we go back to the blog page, the next after this link that I give you in my brief introduction, I then break it down into the sections, right? So just like I did with the intro, we'll start with traditional Active Directory. And you can click on this link and it'll take you to what is Active Directory Domain Services, right? The traditional Active Directory. And that is how it pertains to Windows Server 2016, Windows Server 2012 R2, and Windows Server 2012, right? So, really talking about, the directory structure, all the different things that came along with it, like the data store and kind of how it stores your information, user information, right? Kind of security overview and what you get with that, right? Your schema, like I said, that directory structure with OUs and everything, the global catalog, right? And understanding global catalog and how that functions is really good to know, especially if you're going to extend your Active Directory on-prem into Azure. You should consider making the virtual machine in Azure a global catalog. So any requests coming from workloads in Azure don't have to go back through the VPN and leave Azure for requests to go back and hit the on-prem global catalog. They can make all those requests internal. That would eliminate egress charges. So anytime you leave Azure, you're getting charged for that. So if you can minimize that communication leaving Azure by leveraging a global catalog in Azure, that's good architecture, that's good design. Then talks about query, things like that, replication services, right? And you can drill down into, understanding the FSMO roles, right? PD, the PD emulator or schema emulator, RID master, all that stuff, right? Your schema, your understanding your trust, all those different terminologies, right? And like I said, this is part of the identity and access kind of table of contents and section in the Microsoft doc. Huge information here. And like I said, identity and access is, it's just at the forefront of everything. So feel free to drill down into that. After that link to the documentation, I provide this topology, this architecture diagram. This is a diagram that represents extending your existing on-prem Active Directory domain services, which is replicated or depicted here, replicated through a VPN device, through VPN or express route into Azure as infrastructure with your line of business apps sitting on, virtual machines or what have you. And then you have another domain controller with another server for DNS or whatever, and all communicating through your VPN, right? And I'll show you how that looks in the demo later on, but this is kind of how you would extend that and what that design looks. I then provide another link here for lab purposes. So if you're interested in setting up a traditional Active Directory in Azure on a virtual machine and promoting it to a domain controller and all that, Azure Learn, if you guys know, I am a big fan of it. It's a lab here where you can use Microsoft resources. They'll go through all the different considerations, concepts, things like that, and you can run through the lab yourself. So really getting some hands-on exposure right out of the gate. So after this link here, I have this link, which is the brief write-up of traditional Active Directory domain services and kind of how that works with Windows servers, LDAP, NTLM, Kerberos, all that stuff. If you didn't want to drill down into the overview, you already knew it, you can read this. The next section here is what is Active Directory? What is Azure Active Directory, right? And that was the cloud version, right? The identity provider for getting to federated services out in the cloud, right? With third-party vendors, things like that. And this topology kind of depicts extending on-prem Active Directory into the cloud for you to get these third-party services leveraging SSO, right? Now you can click on this link here. What is Azure Active Directory? Once again, that'll take you to Microsoft's documentation. Great overview here, talking about the stuff that I mentioned, right? Microsoft 365, Azure Portal, SaaS applications, getting a quick start, creating a new tenant, kind of what's around that, comparing the different Active Directory, and I have a link to that further on the blog as well. We click on that, how it works with Azure AD and IT admins, app developers, and getting to your SaaS applications and how you use the different RBAC and role-based access control methods. How licensing works in Azure AD, right? Huge topic there. So Azure AD comes in different flavors. There's a free version, and then you get to the premium SKUs. The free version is what you get when you're just procuring the Microsoft Suite or an Azure subscription, and then you get into the premium SKUs when you want additional services, kind of like self-service write back for password self-service reset, right? For users that forget their password and they want to change it by themselves, you'd need P1 to do that. P2 gives you things like conditional access and privileged identity management, kind of providing additional governance around the guys who have the keys to the castle, right? The guys that have global administrators and things like that. And then we talk about B2C, right, and B2B, right, when we're getting to business and business to corp, and there's more documentation here in these sections, and kind of how you integrate your Azure AD tenant with somebody else who has an Azure AD tenant, and you need to access workloads that maybe they have in their tenant. You can do something like B2B, and then B2C if you're leveraging something from a third-party application and they want to share their stuff. So really drilling down into this documentation, there's a ton of value there. As well. So you can see here, it goes on, talks about terminology, and then you can go down to the different sections, and yeah, feel free to drill down into this stuff as well. We then get into the section of managing your identity and access, right? So I provide another link here. If we click on that, that takes you to the Azure Learn section here, and there's a whole path set up for Azure Active Directory. And this path is part of the Azure Security Engineer. So you can go through all these labs and it talks about how to secure Azure with RBAC and things like I talked about with step number 1, creating an Azure account, managing the users in the groups in Azure Active Directory, creating users and groups in Azure Active Directory, securing it with application proxy with OpenID and Azure AD, and each one of these has a subset of sections throughout the lab. So really great content here. I'd say, drill down to this. It's free, and you guys don't have to incur any cost by driving anything up in Azure Active Directory or in Azure to get any costs. I then have my brief write-up here of what Azure Active Directory is. Like I said, if you didn't want to go through the overview, you can just get that synopsis here and what it doesn't provide, right, and kind of what it does give you. The next section here is what is Azure Active Directory Domain Services, right? And this is that subset of what traditional Active Directory is. It's an extension and it's built off of Azure Active Directory, and then Azure Active Directory works with Azure Active Directory Domain Services and replicates those user accounts and all that stuff below. And you would have your Azure infrastructure here with all your line of business apps with your virtual networks and your virtual machines that run in Azure, and they could do, device join and stuff like that. I then, right here, if you click on this link, there's a tutorial. So if you guys are looking to deploy Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is the managed domain, that PaaS offering, you can walk through this line by line. It'll tell you the prerequisites, logging into the portal, creating the managed stuff, what you have to think about, a lot of tips, right? So when you're setting up your naming convention, right? And I told you it's going to be a different namespace, right? So it's not going to be your companyname.com. It's going to be like Azure AD DS Contoso.com, right? So it's going to be that one-way forest domain trust. So you have to take into consideration your namespacing and stuff like that, right? So it walks you through it. I won't go through the full walking through and the deploying and how that looks, but I'll show you where to get through it in the demo when we touch on that further. And this is in the Azure Active Directory Domain Services documentation. Like I said, this is in the tutorial section. You can drill down and get even further through that, or you can look at the kind of overview and get all that information. Below the tutorial, I then have my brief write-up of what that is, right? We already covered that. The next section here is around Azure AD Connect, right? So I talked about you have existing on-prem Active Directory, you want to enable single sign-on, you want to extend your identity and your credentials of your users into Azure, and you want them to use the same profile, you would leverage Azure AD Connect. And I have a brief write-up here, like I said, right, Azure AD Domain Services and traditional Active Directory both can integrate with Azure AD using Azure AD Connect. And for some of you guys that are familiar, it's originally DirSync, but this is more robust, right, because DirSync came out before really, Azure was that, prolific out in the internet. So we click on this link here, it takes you to Microsoft documentation. There's a ton of good information here, really around understanding the methodology, the use cases, when you do it, what your business need is, what your strategy, when you would use this, defining the different strategy of when to use the different feature sets, what's the difference between cloud identities, what's being synchronized, federated services, and I touched on that, right, with Facebook and things like that, and leveraging your single sign-on. and then it provides some information, right, glossary, and what the client experience is around that. It then drills down into the strategy, like the synchronization and the topology. And this is really what I wanted to cover here, kind of really important for you guys to understand. When you're going with Azure AD Connect, there are different topologies that are supported and others that aren't, and this goes down into that. There's another link here that I'll show you in a second that drills down into it even more. But when you're working with one Active Directory forest on-prem, that works with one Azure AD Connect server, and that'll replicate to one tenant. If you have multiple forests all through one Azure AD Connect server replicating to one tenant, that works. But there are other use cases where it doesn't work, and I'll show you how that is. So if we drill up here, like I said, this is great documentation, topologies for Azure AD Connect. We click here, and like I said, it drills down into it even more. And it tells you what the different symbols mean, what's, kind of what the symbols, and how to read this documentation. So if you had multiple forests and you wanted to replicate them all to one tenant, that's not supported, right? So really a great place to go to when you're going to be deploying these features in SSO. Really come here, make sure you're taking all this stuff into consideration, and you can, really make sure you're deploying it in the correct way. So we jump out of that. That is the tutorial around Azure AD Connect and kind of, all that strategy. Actually, I have the right up here, and we talked about that. Here's that symbol, that topology. The next link I have is another compare. And if you guys have ever been on calls with me, if you've ever talked about stuff, and I'd look forward to talking to all of you. This is a link that I share with all partners and customers when I do get a chance to talk to them. So I get this conversation a lot. Hey, I want to use this. What's the different versions of Active Directory? I heard about this. Why would I use what? This is a great place to go. If you've already heard about the stuff but just need to fill in some gaps and want something that's very quick and maybe like a table that shows you all the different features and functionality, this will show you what that gives. So you can see high level, Active Directory Domain Services, what that is, right? LDAP, all those different features and functionality, provides you different, that's the traditional Active Directory, sorry, leads you to the links that I provided. There's a section for Azure Active Directory, right? The Microsoft, SaaS, and then the platform as a service with the NTLM and all that stuff, right? It goes down into additional features and spells out what all the different feature sets are. And then, like I said, you drill down and here's that table that shows you kind of what each option provides, right, with the different versions of AD DS, right? And you can see the managed service offering is included with the PaaS Azure AD DS versus your traditional server that you'd have to do the carrying and feeding. But you don't get domain enterprise administrator privileges because there's no forest domain structure, as well as the geo distribution, right, and schema extensions. So you can't do some of the stuff with the platform as a service that you can do here. So you can drill down, you can talk about Azure AD DS and Azure AD and how they work in conjunction, setting up single sign-on, things like that, Windows Hello, if that's what you wanted to enable, and kind of how you get your mobile device management and extending cell phones and laptops into Azure AD for Azure AD registered or Azure AD joined devices. Not the same as traditional infrastructure domain join. This is more for extending licensing for M365 suite SKUs. So when you get M365, by default, you get like 5 licenses or something like that. So this allows you those licenses to be divvied up based on the device and the identity that's associated with that. So like I said, more documentation here. You can drill down and you can go to next steps and see even more information there. So the takeaway I want to show you here, this is my the last kind of write-up that I had was really around when to use what. So if you have a customer that is 100% Microsoft adoption, or they're a small size SMB, minimal, infrastructure as a service, maybe Azure AD with Azure AD DS, right? The platform as a service for virtual machine, mobile device management, and device join, maybe that's enough for you. Maybe that's fine. But maybe if you're working with a customer that has existing on-prem, they're used to working with self-managed virtual machines or self-managed infrastructure. Maybe they have SCOM or some automation or SUS/WUS server or something like that was doing the patching. Maybe leveraging a domain controller on a virtual machine with Azure AD is the way to go, right? So you can kind of not worry about large-scale mergers and acquisitions that might get in the way with a one-way forest outbound trust, right, with multiple domain names. So that's my high-level takeaway there, and you can read that further here. This last representation is kind of all the different flavors and what services they offer, so you can kind of digest that. So that's high level, what's on my blog page. I want to go through that. Let's jump into the Azure Portal, and I'm going to show you what some of these features and where they are with the different versions of Active Directory. So we're here in the Azure Portal, and I want to drill down into Azure Active Directory. You can see that right away. I have this already on the side of the blade, and it'll take me to my overview page where it names my tenant, what my role is, what SKU I have, and we talked about the premium SKUs and so on, right? And it talks about, it shows you already like users and groups, right? And these are, like I said, if you had Azure AD, Azure Active Directory by itself, it would be its own separate database, right, with users and groups. If you wanted to extend that stuff, you'd have to leverage Azure AD Connect, where you would see users and groups that have been replicated from on-prem into it. You can drill down into the the roles and the administrators, and we touched on that with step number 1 with RBAC, so you can kind of go back and reference that. Talk about enterprise applications and device management, right? We talked about devices, app registration, and what apps have access to be able to manipulate services in Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. And we have some identity governance, application proxy, right? I talked about if you have a line of business app on-prem that has a web front end and you want to publish it out through Azure Active Directory, that's where you would go to set that up. The licenses that are associated with your M365 SKUs or your P2 SKUs, you would manage that here. Your Azure Active Directory Connect, right? So if you've set up single sign-on and you're replicating from on-prem Active Directory into Azure, this is where you would look at that replication and see the health of that. And if there's any issues with your on-prem communicating with this, you can drill down, as well as mobile device management and things like that, right? So we can look at identity and governance, and high level, I talked about privileged identity management, right? And you can see that here, PIM. Once you get P2, you would drill down into identity and governance, where you add additional safeguards around roles and requests. So if somebody who has a global admin, they might have that role, but they can't access it and they can't perform any functions until they submit a request, and then either a senior member or a group of senior members provide that or approve that request, then they can take action in your tenant. So really great additional safeguards. That's high level there. I did want to show you, and I'll drill down here. If you wanted to deploy Azure Active Directory Domain Services, the platform as a service offering, you can just scroll down here and you can see that as the featured service that's part of Azure Active Directory. So if I were to click on this, it would take me right to the wizard to create Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So this is that platform as a service where it's going to spin up the 2 virtual machines that are managed and supported by Microsoft and that replica set, right? And I can just click on this, and I provided the link to the tutorial in the blog page. You can follow through that. But really, I just want to show you this, what the wizard looks like high level, where it's going to ask me what my subscription is, what my resource group that I want to put it in, demo, whatever, the domain name, I can use the same one or I can create a new one. It's already associated with my Azure subscription here. Different SKUs of what I'm looking for, what I'm trying to do, and kind of all the different options there. I can then click next, and it's going to take me to the networking section where it's asking me what virtual network has access to, or where is this managed infrastructure going to live, right? And who has access to that based on VNet. And I could deploy it in a new VNet, or I can put it in another VNet that I have and a subnet, right? I can then click next, whatever I decide. It'll give me some more stuff around administration and who has access to things. I can click next there. And then it talks about the synchronization and that one-way synchronization from Azure Active Directory, right? Because everything only goes in one direction into Azure AD Domain Services. And what do I want to be replicated? You can have everything get replicated, or you can do scoped and you can select different groups. So maybe only certain things are going to get replicated down from whether it's on-prem or just Azure Active Directory, what gets replicated down into your fully managed LDAP and Kerberos, right? So then I can click next, and it's going to go through and validate that everything I did is correct, and then I can just hit create. But I won't go through that because I already have a domain controller that's set up in my environment. So let's go jump into virtual machines, and I'm going to show you what I have and what I've set up. So if I jump into the virtual machines here, I see I have two different machines as of now. One of them is just a demo machine. It's actually stopped deallocated, so I'm only paying for the storage. This machine here is another virtual machine you see. It's running. It's called ACAD02, and that means Azure Chris Active Directory 02. So what I'm saying is this is my second domain controller, and this second domain controller lives in Azure, right? So I can drill down to the virtual machines. I can see what the resource group is that it's running, what the OS is, the size of the virtual machine, and I can cover some more of this stuff when we get into our 10 steps to get started with virtual machines. But high level, this shows you kind of all the different specs and everything around the virtual machine. And I could take actions on stuff. I could even use Azure Bastion and jump in as a jump host and get access to the actual OS. But I don't need to do that because I have a VPN set up, and I'm replicating kind of what it would look like for a customer that has on-prem Active Directory syncing to Active Directory in Azure through the VPN. So let's jump on the VMware environment, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So we're here in my VMware environment, and if you guys missed my last 10 steps to get started around Azure Virtual WAN and VPN, well, if you saw it, you would have seen this console before, or if you're familiar with VMware, this is Vsphere. And like I said, this is depicting my on-prem environment. So say I had a domain controller and a bunch of other virtual machines here, that's what you would see, right? Line of business apps, database servers, things like that. This is my VPN gateway, so I can connect to my Azure environment. This is my domain controller. I can, pop into it and I can take action on it just like I was in a local area network. So if I click here, I've already opened it. This is my domain controller. As you see, it's ACAD01. Like I said, ACAD02 is in Azure. This is my first domain controller. I'm here in Active Directory users and computers. Like I said, traditional Active Directory, you have that schema, that data store where your companyname.com is there, and you have the organizational units broken out where you have your computer accounts, and you have your organizational units for your different departments, right? So I have IT, where my user is here. I have a sales user, sales OU, marketing OU, and different users. And then you can provide different things based on what group, right? Resource delegation, depending on what group, maybe they have access to certain file shares or not, right? And this is traditional Active Directory, right? And I could go here and I can do a ping and look at, I have connectivity. So I wanted to show you this real quick. I'm going to RDP into my second domain controller. So through the VPN, I have my ACAD02. I'm on the domain controller that's in Azure. All the requests that would be for authentication or anything that take place in Azure are here, right? And I can expand this. And here I have Active Directory sites and services open, where I have the domain controller in Azure and the domain controller that's on-prem, right, replicated there, and kind of my different subnets and what those IP spacing is, right? I can drill down and look at the same tools, right? Users and computers, I can launch that and see the same thing that I saw on-prem. I have the same extended schema, I have the same domain names. I can click on start, I can go to administrative tools, and I can drill down and kind of look for something like group policy management, right? Maybe I have VDI, Windows Virtual Desktop, and I want to start locking down stuff or doing mappings, device mappings or things like that. I can then go in here and create some GPOs. So really some good stuff there, right? So that's really high level. That's the information I wanted to kind of show you around traditional Active Directory, kind of what it looks and feels like, to deploy this and extend it from on-prem into Azure through a VPN. These are the three major flavors. I hope you find this useful. Click like, click subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions, anything that you'd like to see, or like me to, create a video based on kind of what we're looking to talk about. If you want me to get into anything a little bit deeper, let me know. Like I said, click like, click subscribe. Hopefully you find this stuff useful, and let me know what you think. And come back and join me on step number 7, and we'll continue on with our journey. I look forward to talking to you guys again in the future. Take care now.